Good afternoon. I'm going to remind you of a couple of things that were mentioned yesterday by a number of other speakers, particularly Dr. Castro, when he introduced the transition work that the NATO panel was doing. What I'm going to spend with you is perhaps 5-6 minutes just describing in quite brief detail at a higher level how the UK government looks after its veterans and the sort of governmental institutions and also working with, we call them charities in Britain, but across the world they're called not-for-profits or non-governmental organizations. So when you hear me mention the word charity, I'm talking about those other types of organizations. And I think in order to situate it first, it's very important that you understand how we classify veterans in the UK, and this is one particular thing. We have a universal definition of a veteran, and that is we define a veteran as any individual has served for just one day. That is regardless of whether you've had active service or been on active duty or an operation. You can come into a training unit, leave of your own right within the first 8 weeks, for example, and still be classified as a veteran. So we make no distinction on entitlement for veterans or the type of discharge. To give you an idea of the number of veterans we have in the United Kingdom, based on the National Statistics Annual Population Survey, which was published in October last year, there were 2.5 million, 2.5 million veterans living in the UK as at 2016. Interestingly, 50% of those veterans are aged 75 and over. So it's a fact of life, unfortunately, but over the next 10 years, that elderly veterans population will expire effectively. So in about 10 years' time, that number of veterans that we have, we expect that to halve to about 1.3 million. The reason that we have elderly veterans, obviously, most of those are from the 50% over 75 are from the World War II generation. We also have something in the UK which we put in place in 2011 called the Armed Forces Covenant. And what this does is it ensures that both serving personnel and veterans are not disadvantaged in any way, that they receive the same levels of support that an ordinary civilian would in the public space. So when they access goods and services, whether that's from a commercial company or whether it's from a government service, such as the National Health Service that we have in the United Kingdom, for example. And in certain circumstances, that a special provision will be made in appropriate circumstances. We also had, as of last year, what we call the Ministerial Covenant and Veterans Board, which is a cross-government piece supported by the Prime Minister, chaired jointly by the Cabinet First Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence. And I'll describe in a moment in more detail how that works, and you'll see on a diagram. And that is the board that is responsible for coordinating all veterans' affairs across government. And finally, later this year, so long as our research goes well, we'll be publishing a UK map of need for our veterans and families to help focus, future focus funding through the Armed Forces Covenant Fund, which is a fund that we've established in the UK to provide support for projects which will support veterans and the service community. That's a £10 million fund in what we call perpetuity. So year on year, going into the future, we will be allocating £10 million to that grants fund to support projects which support veterans in the community. Just a quick bit now on the, sorry, I've just described that slide there. Moving on to the Armed Forces Covenant. What the Armed Forces Covenant does, just to recapitulate on what I said a few moments ago, it is to ensure that serving personnel and veterans are not disadvantaged with the access of goods and services by their service. So what that means is, for example, if you were to serve on a foreign tour in Germany, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, for example, you have a different profile, perhaps for credit rating, if you wish to have a loan when you come back to the UK. Until about 2 or 3 years ago, you would have had a problem getting a loan because you've been out of the country for a year or two. Your credit rating has been hit. You're serving your nation in the defense of the nation, and so that's an example of a disadvantage that has been applied to UK veterans and serving personnel. That has now been removed by significant liaison between the government and the finance industry to ensure that that level of disadvantage has been removed. So we have no advantage, but we have no disadvantage compared with the normal population for access to credit because service personnel and, in a certain extent, veterans move around. Also, and very importantly, what the Covenant has done is it places an obligation on the nation to look after serving personnel and veterans with the nation's institutions and the local government. So, for example, local councils in the UK have to adhere to the no disadvantage policy dictated by the Armed Forces Covenant. And this first point here on this slide talks about all local authorities in the UK have signed the Armed Forces Covenant, and over 2,400 businesses, charitable and public sector organisations have signed, pledging their support to the Armed Forces community. Now, what does this mean in reality? It means that they will not discriminate the fact that you are a serving individual or a veteran when you approach, say, a council for housing help or for access to other services or for childcare support or something like that. Access to employment with companies. Some companies, for example, would look at you or would look at your spouse. If the non-serving spouse looking for employment would be considered, for example, oh, well, you're going to be moving around again in 2 or 3 years' time, we won't offer you the job. That is discrimination, and these 2,400 large FTSE 500 companies, so big employers in the UK, have all signed up to this scheme, that they will remove that disadvantage. They will not look at someone as the spouse of a serving person or a veteran and consider them, oh, well, you've served, you might have post-traumatic stress disorder, we don't want to employ you in our company, or whatever. So it's removed, and where we still find that disadvantage applies, we apply very high political pressure to ensure that through the structures I'll show you, to ensure that that sort of disadvantage is removed. This next slide shows how we run the veterans agenda, and this is the clear slide which shows that we do not have in the UK a separate veterans agency or veterans ministry. Veterans Affairs are the responsibility or for coordinating within the UK Ministry of Defence, and that's quite a significant thing. You'll be hearing from other countries where they do have separate ministries and so on and so forth, or separate departments. So everything in purple on that slide is what is government. So, top left, we have the Ministry of Defence. That's where I work. I also mentioned to you the Ministerial Covenant and Veterans Board, which you see there to the right of the Ministry of Defence. And that is the board which coordinates across government all matters relating to veterans. I think a very important point to make is that veterans are civilians. They are no longer military. We have a duty of care to support them, but rather like any other member of the civilian community, other state departments look after their civilian needs. For example, housing, health, employment, benefits, social care. So why should veterans be any different? We just have to make sure we remove the disadvantage. And that is why the Veterans Matters and Veterans Affairs are focused within the MOD, but we coordinate all the actions across government. On the right-hand side, I shall just go through that list of departments. So we have the Department of Health, the Ministry of Justice, the Department of Work and Pensions, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, the Department for Education, Her Majesty's Treasury. They hold the purse strings. They are very important if we need extra money to support veterans. And the Home Office. And finally, but not least, the devolved administrations. Although we're called the United Kingdom, central government has national policies, but we also have Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, who are our devolved administrations. And they are involved in this Ministerial Covenant Veterans Board. So it's very much a cross-government architecture that ensures that veteran matters are delivered properly. And if they're not being delivered, that board is the way in which we sort it out and tell the other government departments to get a grip. The light blue circles on the slide depict non-government bodies, if you like, that we also have an interest in. So going down the left-hand side, the SCPB, that's the Service Charities Partnership Board. So we chair that meeting, the Minister for Veterans, and we do have a Veterans Minister within the MOD. The Veterans Minister chairs that, and that's the interaction between the MOD and the charity or the not-for-profit sector. We also have, the charity sector have an organisation called COBSIO, which is actually called the Confederation of British Service Charities. Not all service charities are a member of this organisation, but it acts as a sort of a funneling point, a sort of a headquarters for a lot of charities that support veterans and service personnel. And that is the conduit through which they would wish to discuss agenda items with the government effectively through the Service Charities Partnership Board. Right at the bottom there, we have the Veterans Gateway. The Veterans Gateway is a charity-funded initiative, although we gave £2 million worth of pump priming money through the Armed Forces Covenant Trust Fund last year. This is a single point of contact. It's a telephone helpline, it's a website, it's a portal that if a veteran does not know where to turn to for help, they will approach the Veterans Gateway. The Veterans Gateway will then take the query and will signpost the veteran to the appropriate intervention that they require. So, for example, if a veteran rings up to say, I'm homeless, I don't know where to go, I don't know who to turn to, they will then give that veteran the appropriate information for the area they are located in. They will give them the phone number for the local council housing officer, for example, and then the veteran should act on that. But more importantly, the Veterans Gateway will also follow up with that veteran in a couple of days to find out if that intervention they were seeking was successful. In the middle of the slide, you'll also see, I've talked about the Armed Forces Covenant, and there it is in the middle of the slide. The Armed Forces Covenant, we administer that also within the MOD. I've told you that if we find that things aren't happening properly, that we will take appropriate action and liaise with an employer perhaps, or even a local authority that doesn't appear to be applying the covenant correctly, which is legally mandated to local authorities. And the three main areas that we would liaise over are obviously with local authorities to ensure that local authorities provide the necessary information and support for serving personnel and veterans in their area. Secondly, employers for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And thirdly, the corporate sector, for example. Not just about employment, but goods and services, for example, for serving personnel and veterans. And then finally, at the bottom of the slide, in purple, this is a wholly owned veterans within the MOD. It's not a separate department. We have an element of the MOD which is called Veterans UK, and within Veterans UK we have the Veterans Welfare Service. which again is another point of reference for veterans who need advice if they know that they need to turn to Veterans UK. We have a helpline which will support them as well. The sorts of things that we are responsible for veterans within the MOD are compensation, pensions, and welfare advice. Other matters which are dealt with in the state sector, that is why we have these other government departments on the right hand of the slide involved in the veterans community, because they would provide those services to the normal civilian population. I'm not going to talk in detail about this particular slide as it's very busy, but this is a much more detailed version of how the Armed Forces Covenant governance works. So at the top level, in purple, we have ministerial external engagement, for example, with the Services Charities Partnership Board I've just mentioned, and we've also on the right-hand side got the Ministerial Covenant and Veterans Board. And that distills right down to what we call working level. So the sort of meetings that I go to the top level meetings as well, but quite often those meetings are agreeing strategies and policies. Down at the working level, at the bottom of the slide, that's where we get the real traction with the doers, the delivery partners that are out there. So if something is going wrong or something is not being provided correctly, that lower level tier is where we would get the engagement with the delivery partners and get some action to change something. So that was a very quick canter through the sort of the UK model for how we support veterans. The main point to take away from this is that we embody the veterans focus entirely within the MOD, and we do not have a separate department. It works within the British culture. I work with my colleagues in America, Canada, and a number of other nations where a separate department also works. And believe me, we have also considered that. But the team that I work in currently within the Ministry of Defence is the Covenant team. You've heard about the Covenant. And within that, my specialisation is veterans and transition. So that's where our focus is. To give you an idea of my minister, he's called Minister for Defence Personnel and Veterans. So he doesn't just look after veterans, but 50% of his work is directly related to veterans. So it's a big issue and a big responsibility, and thankfully, he's very forward-facing on this. So at the moment in the UK, there are lots of initiatives that the government is prepared to support for veterans. Thank you very much.